Hello YouTube! In this video I'm going to outline Quine's criticism of the analytic-synthetic distinction. This is one of the central distinctions in philosophy, and the basic idea of this distinction can be stated quite easily. So there are two kinds of propositions. Analytic propositions are propositions that are true or false in virtue of the meanings of the terms alone. So examples include all bachelors are unmarried, if it's raining then it's raining, 2 plus 2 equals 4, triangles have 5 sides. Then synthetic propositions are propositions that are true or false partly in virtue of meaning and also partly in virtue of the way the world is. So Frank Zappa was a musician, smoking causes cancer, the sky is green, all philosophers are poor, and so on. So, it's true that smoking causes cancer. Now, this is true partly in virtue of the meanings of the terms. If the word smoking had referred to running instead, then smoking causes cancer would have been false. But its truth is also dependent on the facts in the world, right? So nothing about the word smoking in itself entails that it causes cancer. We might have discovered that smoking prevented cancer. I mean, indeed, it was once thought that smoking had health benefits, right? So, the world could have turned out that way, but it didn't. But the point is what makes this sentence true is something about the way the world is. By contrast, take a statement like, all bachelors are unmarried. Well, what makes this true is just the meanings of the terms. Part of what it is to be a bachelor is to be unmarried. So there's no scenario that could render this false, no matter what happens, no matter what way the world turns out to be. This could not be false. If you think you can conceive of a bachelor who is married, you just fail to understand the words. So this is the basic distinction, right? Some propositions are true because of what the world is like. Some propositions are true just because of the meanings of the terms involved, and similarly for false propositions. Now, this distinction is important because it has been applied to many other sort of topics and problems within philosophy. So many philosophers have thought that if we have some notion of analytic truths, if we have this notion of analyticity, then we can make sense of a priori knowledge, that is, truths that are known independently of experience. So we don't need to investigate the world to discover that all bachelors are unmarried. We can know that all bachelors are unmarried just by understanding the terms in the sentence. Provided we understand the words, there can be no doubt as to its truth. So analytic truths can be known independent of experience. For the same reason, analytic truths are necessary. They could not have been false. They are true in all possible worlds, to use the modern parlance. Now, this permits a neat account of the truths of logic and mathematics. Logic and mathematics appear to be a priori disciplines. They don't depend on empirical investigation. When Andrew Wiles proved Fermat's last theorem, he didn't proceed by deriving predictions from the theorem and then performing experiments. That's not generally how mathematics works, right? Instead, you work out the consequences of various axioms. The truths of logic and mathematics are also necessary. There's no possible world in which Fermat's last theorem is false. And there's something of a puzzle about how these non-empirical disciplines work, right? There's something kind of strange about the idea that, well, there is something that calls for explanation in that, it seems like there are truths that we can know, but where they're not in any way, we don't know them by performing experiments, and they seem to be necessarily true. There's a puzzle. What kind of truths are these? And if the truths of logic and mathematics are analytic, well, okay, we at least have the beginnings of a solution to this puzzle. It's like, okay, we're working out what follows from what in virtue of meaning. The analytic-synthetic distinction also lays the ground for a substantive role for philosophy. For much of the 20th century, it was thought that the basic method of philosophy was conceptual analysis, where this involves trying to specify the necessary and sufficient conditions for the application of a concept. So take the concept bachelor, for instance. We might sort of break that down into the concept of not being married and the concept of man. So all unmarried men are bachelors and only unmarried men are bachelors. a bachelor is an unmarried man, and the point is that being an unmarried man is necessary and sufficient for being a bachelor. Now, bachelor, of course, is not a particularly interesting concept in itself, but think about a concept like knowledge. Much of the literature on knowledge involves conceptual analysis of knowledge. Traditionally, it was held that knowledge is justified true belief. So we'd say that S knows that P just in case P is true, S believes that P, and S's belief that P is justified. But this is famously challenged by Gettier cases, cases in which a person has justified true belief but does not have knowledge. So think about a case where somebody, wakes up in the morning, they go downstairs, they look at the clock, it says 8 o'clock, and it is in fact 8 o'clock. So it looks like they have a justified true belief that it's 8 o'clock. But now imagine that the clock had stopped at 8 o'clock the night before. Well, do they know that it's 8 o'clock? Arguably not. So we have justified true belief without knowledge. Justified true belief is not sufficient for knowledge. So knowledge is not justified true belief. And then, of course, other epistemologists will try to propose other analyses of knowledge that get around these sorts of cases. So essentially, conceptual analysis of some concept involves proposing the necessary and sufficient conditions for the application of the concept and then testing that against our intuitions about various cases. We look for cases where the proposed conditions are satisfied but where the concept would not be applied, or cases where we would apply the concept but where the conditions are not satisfied. There's a lot of philosophy that works in this sort of mould. And of course, one very straightforward way to account what's going on here is to say, well, philosophers are investigating the analytic truths, right? They're trying to work out what's true in virtue of meaning. Now, look, what I've just said here is it's very brief, and there are many objections we might have to this way of characterizing things. Still, I think that it's reasonably intuitive that there's a gap between the conceptual parts of inquiry, which proceed by investigating meaning and working out what follows from what, and the empirical parts of inquiry, which require us to perform experiments and make observations of the world. There seems to be a difference here, and the analytic-synthetic distinction kind of can underlie this gap between the different areas of inquiry, right? So when we're sort of doing the conceptual stuff, we're dealing with analytic truths, and when we're doing the empirical stuff, we're investigating the synthetic truths. So yeah, philosophers have tried to use analyticity to explain notions like a priori knowledge and necessary truths, and maybe even try to create a role for philosophy as a sort of autonomous discipline. So this is a very nice picture. It's a nice picture, very influential. But a critique of this was presented by W.V.O. Quine in his paper Two Dogmas of Empiricism. Now, Two Dogmas of Empiricism was written primarily in response to logical positivism, which is a bit outside the scope of this particular video. But the arguments that were given by Quine have obviously been influential beyond this. So Quine argues that there is no analytic-synthetic distinction. There are no statements that are true purely in virtue of meaning. And of course, this is something going to follow. Well, nothing can be known a priori. All statements must in one way or the other be tested against experience. As Quine sees it, there's no way to isolate some set of substantive truths that are not vulnerable to empirical disconfirmation. So in the rest of this video, we're going to outline Quine's arguments. All right then. So our question is, what exactly is analyticity? So I gave a brief sort of intuitive characterization of the analytic-synthetic distinction when I began this video, but we want to define it precisely. Like, what exactly is analyticity? What is it for a statement to be analytic? Well, the obvious place to begin is by looking at how past philosophers have understood analyticity. Quine says, he attributes to Kant the following view, that analytic statements are those which attribute to the subject no more than is already conceptually contained in the subject concept. So if I say bachelors are unmarried, the predicate concept unmarried is already contained within the subject concept bachelor. So anything that's a bachelor must be unmarried, because when I apply this concept bachelor, that just is to apply the concept unmarried. Like one of the things I'm doing when I call something a bachelor is I'm calling it unmarried, because like being unmarried is just contained within the concept of bachelor. Well, okay, this sounds nice. There are a couple of drawbacks to this. First of all, this is only going to apply to subject-predicate sentences. It's not obvious how to extend this characterization of analyticity to other sentences, like if it's raining, then water is pouring from the sky. More seriously, the notion of conceptual containment is not really any better understood than the notion of analyticity. Right? This notion of one concept containing another, that's just a metaphor. I mean, a concept isn't literally a box into which other concepts might be put. So Quine says, well, this doesn't really get us much further in terms of having a clear characterization of analyticity. Okay, so another attempt then is to say that a statement is analytic just in case its denial results in a contradiction. So if you take the sentence like bachelors are unmarried, the idea is going to be that if I deny this, if I claim that some bachelors are married, then I have contradicted myself. Okay, what's the problem with this? So Alex Miller, in his Introduction to Philosophy of Language, suggests that we can kind of distinguish between two senses of contradiction. First of all, there's a purely syntactic notion of contradiction. Well, in this case, a statement is self-contradictory only if it has the syntactic form P and not P. So if I say Frank is a bachelor and it is not the case that Frank is a bachelor, that would be an example of a syntactic contradiction. Now, this notion is perfectly well understood. We have no problem formalizing statements and identifying logical contradictions in this sense. The trouble is that in many cases, denying an analytic truth is not going to take this form. So if I claim that Frank is a married bachelor, I realise that I'm looking at my slides here and I've messed up because that should say, second, there is a broader sense of contradiction which includes statements such as Frank is a married bachelor. So just flip that in your head. So Frank is a married bachelor. This is supposed to be an example of the second sort of contradiction. If I claim that Frank is a married bachelor, that statement does not have the syntactic form P and not P. So if this is a contradiction, we must be assuming some broader notion of contradiction. This isn't just a purely syntactic contradiction. So corresponding to these two notions of contradiction, Quine distinguishes two classes of analytic statement. So analytic statements of the first class are logical truths, and we identify these purely in virtue of their syntactic form. What makes these statements true are the arrangement of their purely logical terms. So these are terms like all, some, not, and, if, then, etc. These are the sorts of, the terms that we would use when describing the logical operators, basically. When we're dealing with logical truths, we can give any interpretation we like of the non-logical terms. So I say, all unmarried men are unmarried. And then we can sort of put this in slightly more formal notation as, for all x, if ux, then ux. It doesn't matter how you interpret the terms unmarried and men here. You can have any interpretation of those that you like. This is going to come out as being true. This is true just as a matter of logic. Quine accepts this notion, but then there are analytic statements of the second class, and these are more problematic. So when I say all bachelors are unmarried, or all vixens are female foxes, well, these are not true in virtue of syntactic form alone. These are not true in virtue of their just sort of surface logical form. So what exactly is it that makes them true? Now notice, of course, that it's going to be analytic statements of the second class that are of interest to philosophers. When we, propose a conceptual analysis, for instance, such as that knowledge is justified true belief, that's an analytic statement of the second class. It's not just a trivial truth of logical form. So the question is, how do we make sense of analytic statements of the second class? Well, an initial idea that Quine considers is to appeal to synonymy. So here's the idea. We can say that an analytic truth, P is an analytic truth, just in case either, 1, P is a logical truth, or 2, P can be transformed into a logical truth by substituting synonymous terms. So this is going to be, if it's a logical truth, it's an analytic statement of the first class. If it can be transformed into a logical truth by substituting synonymous terms, it's an analytic statement of the second class. So basically, via synonymy, we can transform analytic statements of the second class into analytic statements of the first class. Let's say I take all female foxes are vixens. The idea is that the word vixen is synonymous with female fox. So we can replace female fox in that initial sentence to get all vixens are vixens, which is just a straightforward logical truth. And that's going to remain true no matter how you interpret the statement vixen, right? No matter what vixens refers to, that's going to be true. So there we have it. Similarly, if you take all bachelors are unmarried, by substituting synonyms for synonyms, we get all unmarried men are unmarried, a logical truth. We can make all bachelors are unmarried into a logical truth by substituting synonyms for synonyms. But now, what exactly is it for two terms to be synonymous? What is synonymy? I mean, clearly, when we have two synonymous terms, they're not exactly the same, right? So we're not dealing with a sort of complete identity of all of the things that we might call meaning, such as Quine says, psychological associations or poetic quality. In that sense, vixen and female fox are clearly not synonymous. They're not exactly identical in terms of like poetic quality. So, okay, what the hell is synonymy then? Well, it seems simple enough. Two terms are synonymous, just in case those terms have the same definition. So now we're appealing to the idea that there is a correct definition of terms, right? If we say that two terms have the same definition, then we can say that they're synonymous, and then we can use that to ground this notion of analyticity. Now, Quine does grant that in one context, this idea of correct definition is perfectly acceptable. And this is where we give stipulative definitions. So suppose that I introduce the abbreviation FF and I just stipulate that FF abbreviates female fox. Well, I mean, this doesn't, I'm not appealing to any prior notion of analyticity or synonymy or sameness of meaning or anything like that. I'm just stipulating an abbreviation. I'm saying like, okay, I'm going to adopt a convention that any use of the words female fox can be substituted for FF. I mean, just imagine like, you're sort of, I don't know, writing down a speech or something like that. And then as you're writing it down, when the person says female fox, you just write it as FF, just for convenience. So, I can say all female foxes are FFs and then transform that into all female foxes are female foxes because the term FF is just stipulated as an abbreviation for female fox. The problem is that most analytic truths are not supposed to be mere stipulative definitions. In fact, most definitions are not mere stipulative definitions. So when I propose a definition of the word vixen, I'm not just stipulating that it abbreviates female fox. No, I have to think about how that word is used. I have to think about what the word means. In this case, the language already exists. I'm saying something about meanings that are pre-existent within a language, right? Like we have this language already, which has the word vixen, and it has the expression female fox, and I'm saying, vixen means female fox. That's something I'm working out. I'm not stipulating it. So Quine says, in this kind of case, giving a definition of a term can't explain synonymy because it presupposes synonymy, right? What it is to define some term A as B is to suppose that A and B are synonymous. So think about, the process of writing a dictionary. When you do that, you might make an error, right? I mean, you know, you could get it wrong. If all definitions were just stipulative definitions, it would make no sense to speak of an error here. When you stipulate that FF abbreviates female fox, you can't be wrong about that. It's not like you haven't made some mistake. But a dictionary, well, that can obviously contain errors. That can contain mistakes. So, you know, when we're giving a definition, we're trying to state the meanings that are implicit in some prior usage of the word, and that means it's not a stipulation. It's going to presuppose synonymy. Now there is a worry about this part of Quine's argument, because you might say, well, you know, hang on a minute, Quine is granting that there is such a thing as synonymy. Synonymy occurs in stipulative definitions. Moreover, Quine seems to grant that if there is synonymy, then we can define analyticity in terms of it. We can say that the analytic truths of the second class are those that can be transformed into analytic truths of the first class by substituting synonymous terms. So, you know, we've got synonymy, we've got the link between synonymy and analyticity. What more do you want? It seems strange that Quine grants all of this, but then goes on to deny the analytic-synthetic distinction. I mean, I guess to push the point further, we might say, if there is this property of synonymy, and this property can be created by stipulative definition, why can't it be created in other ways? So I think, to be clear, the problem as Quine sees it is that stipulative definitions are just these sort of devices of convenience. We can adopt them or drop them without altering our theories, without any kind of epistemic loss. I mean, again, you know, it's like I'm just sort of copying a speech and then I just introduce a new symbol, and that's all I'm doing. And maybe this does give us some kind of analyticity, but it's not going to be a kind that can do any important philosophical work. You know, remember, philosophers don't just draw this distinction between analytic and synthetic truths like just for its own sake. They see this distinction as doing important work, such as explaining a priori knowledge, or explaining necessary truths, or providing some foundation for logical, mathematical, and philosophical inquiry. A mere stipulative definition is not going to bear this weight. So I do think, you know, Quine is he's at times sort of a little bit unclear about maybe how general his thesis is supposed to be, right? Because on the one hand, you know, he denies the analytic synthetic distinction, but then he does just kind of grant, for the sake of argument, that there are analytic truths of the first class. So there is a kind of analyticity that he's granting, and similarly, you know, he grants that, okay, yeah, you know, you can have stipulative definitions, but I think the important thing to see is that analytic truths of the first class, stipulative definitions, this sort of thing, this isn't going to do the work that philosophers have put the analytic synthetic distinction to, right? You know, they're using this distinction for certain purposes, and we're not going to be able to get that out of the sort of trivial kinds of analyticity that Quine is just granting. You know, when philosophers debate about the correct analysis of knowledge, they're not just stipulating some some abbreviation for the term knowledge, right? Or when I say, you know, vixen is synonymous with female fox, I'm not just stipulating a definition. So Quine concludes, well, this appeal to definition is really not going to help, right? Because you're either going to end up talking about stipulative definitions, which are just too trivial to do the sorts of work that we're wanting, or you're going to end up presupposing synonymy. So you haven't explained synonymy, you're just going to end up presupposing it. Okay then, quick advert. If you like my videos, you can support me on Patreon, and if you check out my Patreon, there's a lot of bonus content there. If you sign up to the Hume tier, there's a bunch of bonus videos available, so you can experience more of me. Most of them are sort of further thoughts on the topics that I talk about in these videos. I also have a PayPal if you just want to send a one-off donation. Obviously, every little helps. It really does. I offer private tutoring in philosophy. I have a degree, a master's and a PhD in philosophy, so I'm more than qualified to do that. Send an email if you're interested, and I have a Discord. The link to all of this stuff will be in the description. Okay then, let's move on. So, synonymy doesn't work, Quine says. So he then turns to another idea, another suggestion, which is Or we might say that two expressions are synonymous, just in case they are interchangeable salva veritate. What the hell does this mean? Well, the idea is that one expression can be replaced with the other expression without altering the truth value of the sentences in which those expressions occur. So if I take vixen and female fox, the idea is, well, any sentence containing the term vixen, in any sentence which has that term, this term can be replaced with the phrase female fox without changing the truth value of the sentence, and vice versa. So if I take Verity is a vixen, I can change that to Verity is a female fox, and these are going to be true under the same conditions, right? So the same conditions under which Verity is a vixen is true will be the conditions under which Verity is a female fox is true. No matter how we sort of alter the world, these are going to have the same truth value. Or vixens have 4 legs to female foxes have 4 legs. Again, true under the same conditions. There are vixens on Mars to there are female foxes on Mars. True under the same conditions. Hunting vixens ought to be banned. Hunting female foxes ought to be banned. True under the same conditions. And so on, and so on for any sentence. So for any sentence of the language, right, we can sort of switch these terms out, and they're going to be true under the same conditions. And of course, that's not the case for just any pair of terms, obviously, right? If you replace the term, so Verity is a vixen, replace vixen with the term bachelor. Verity is a vixen, Verity is a bachelor. These are not true under the same conditions. One can be true and the other can be false. But this is not the case with vixen and female fox. It can't be that one of these sentences is true and the other one is false. Now, there are immediate limitations to this idea. So take, for instance, the statement, vixen has 5 letters. That's true. Female fox has 5 letters. Well, that's false. Now, Quine does point out, well, you can get around this pretty straightforwardly by appealing to a use-mention distinction, right? When I say that vixen has 5 letters, the word vixen is mentioned, not used. I'm not actually using the word vixen. So the idea is that when we can treat vixen enclosed in quotation marks as a new word which refers to the word vixen. So when I say vixen has 5 letters, I'm mentioning the word vixen. I'm essentially using a new word that's constructed by enclosing vixen in quotation marks to refer to the word vixen, and then I'm talking about the properties of that word. I could just as well say that the word Fred, it refers to the word vixen, and then I could say Fred has 5 letters. And that would be true if we've stipulated that Fred is referring to vixen, the word vixen, right? Fred is referring to the word vixen. So when I say Fred has 5 letters, that's like a name. That's a name for the word vixen. Similarly, when I enclose vixen in quotation marks and I say quote vixen end quote has 5 letters, right? When I say that, I'm using this vixen enclosed in quotation marks as a name for the word vixen. So of course we can't then substitute it for female fox because it's a new word. So this is not a counterexample to interchangeability salva veritate. A more serious concern, though, raised by Quine is that whether two expressions are interchangeable salva veritate depends on the expressive resources of the language that we're dealing with. So take the phrases creature with heart and creature with kidneys. These phrases have the same extension. That is to say, they pick out the same things in the actual world. So, as a matter of fact, any creature that has a heart is also a creature with a kidney. So consider the following statements, right? All creatures with hearts are creatures with hearts. All creatures with hearts are creatures with kidneys. Both of these statements are true. Now, if our language contains only the resources to refer to the actual world, then creature with heart and creature with kidney will be interchangeable salva veritate. So if you imagine a language where it's a sort of simple language, and all the language can do is just refer to concrete objects in the actual world. So I have the ability to talk about the table, the cup, the creature with a heart, the creature with a kidney. But like that's it. I can't talk about what might have been or what could have been. I can't talk about what people believe to be the case or anything like that. Like all I can do is just refer to objects and attribute properties to them, and the objects in the actual world. No fiction, no imagination, nothing like that. I'm just talking about the objects that actually exist. In this language, creature with heart and creature with kidneys will be interchangeable because, in fact, all creatures with hearts are creatures with kidneys. So clearly, interchangeability in this language is not going to be sufficient to explain analyticity. We don't want to say that it's an analytic truth that all creatures with hearts are creatures with kidneys. So, this is going to be a problem if we're just dealing with this. If we're dealing with this, somewhat impoverished language, interchangeability in this kind of language isn't sufficient, because the interchangeability of the terms in this language rests on matters of fact, not on meaning. Okay, let's say we add some more predicates to our language. Suppose we add modal operators. So we're now able to say things like necessarily all creatures with hearts are creatures with hearts. Necessarily all creatures with hearts are creatures with kidneys. Well, the first statement here is true, the second is false. It's true that necessarily all creatures with hearts are creatures with hearts. False that necessarily all creatures with hearts are creatures with kidneys. So by substituting the term creature with heart in this case, right, we do not have interchangeability salva veritate. Had evolution taken a different path, then perhaps there could have been creatures with hearts that are not creatures with kidneys. So we've introduced modal terms in our language, terms like necessarily and possibly, terms for describing how things must have been or how things could have been. And in that case, the expressions creature with heart and creature with kidneys are no longer interchangeable salva veritate. By contrast, it looks like we preserve the interchangeability of vixen and female fox. So, compare necessarily all vixens are vixens, necessarily all vixens are female foxes. Well, yeah, that's still true, right? So, if we had a good grasp of this term necessarily, then perhaps we could say that two expressions are synonymous just in case they are necessarily interchangeable salva veritate. The trouble, as far as Quine is concerned, is that we have no better understanding of necessity and these other modal notions than we do of analyticity. Indeed, remember, as we noted at the beginning, part of the work that philosophers are using the analytic synthetic distinction for was to explain necessary truths. So, like, necessity is explained in terms of analyticity, in which case we can't presuppose necessity in order to explain analyticity. Now, I mean, of course, these days, we might challenge Quine's argument here. The development of modal logic and possible world semantics has, as far as most philosophers are concerned, given us a solid foundation for understanding these sorts of modal claims. But this is the problem, right? Like, as far as Quine is concerned, well, appealing to necessity, right? Well, one of the problems, right? One problem here is this appeal to necessity isn't really going to help because necessity is no better understood than analyticity is. Analyticity is supposed to explain necessity. And it might actually be worth noting that even if we did grant this prior understanding of necessity, there are actually other contexts that are going to raise trouble for the interchangeability criterion. So suppose I say, Sydney believes that there is a female fox in his garden versus Sydney believes that there's a vixen in his garden. Now suppose that Sydney is unaware that vixens are female foxes. Sydney thinks that vixen is a term for female stoats. Then arguably it may be true that Sydney has the belief there is a female fox in my garden, but false that Sydney has the belief there is a vixen in my garden. I mean, if you were to ask Sydney, like, okay, do you think there's a vixen in your garden? He'd say no. Do you think there's a female fox in your garden? He'd say yes. And, I mean, appealing to necessity doesn't really seem to help with this kind of case. In fact, if you have, you could have a sort of more impoverished language which does not have modal operators, but as long as it's got the, the belief operator as long as we can refer to people's beliefs. Well, now it looks like interchangeability fails here, because we want to say that vixen is synonymous with female fox, but they're not interchangeable salva veritate. That might be a worry. Okay, so yeah, this is a concern. The general point is this, right? If we consider a simple language that's purely extensional, that only describes the actual matters of fact, interchangeability cannot define analyticity because any co-referring terms will be interchangeable. If the language contains operators like necessarily, well, yeah, in that case, interchangeability might be sufficient, but we don't understand necessity, so we're no further in an explanation of analyticity. And of course, if the language contains, belief operators, then it seems again that interchangeability no longer works. So interchangeability, like whether or not two terms are interchangeable, depends on the expressive resources of the language in question. Okay, Quine then moves on to a final suggestion. Perhaps the problem here is ordinary language. Natural languages are vague and messy, and it can be unclear where to draw the lines between different concepts. So we have this intuitive grasp of the analytic-synthetic distinction, but maybe it's unsurprising that a precise characterization of this distinction would be unavailable for ordinary languages. We can perhaps gain greater clarity by proposing an artificial language with explicit semantical rules. So think about, propositional logic with its precise vocabulary and logical operators whose behavior is precisely defined according to the truth tables. So, we construct a new language, an artificial language, where we just lay down the rules of the language. Now, according to Quine, analyticity is going to remain unclear, even if we just consider the artificial languages. Okay, so the most straightforward way to appeal to semantic rules here is to think about a formal language that explicitly specifies all of its analytic statements. So imagine a set of rules where the rules just tell us directly which statements count as analytic and which count as synthetic. Quine says, well, this isn't going to help us understand analyticity. In a language with such rules, we can understand what statements the rules attribute analyticity to, but we won't by this method understand what analyticity is. Indeed, there won't really be anything that analyticity is, just from a set of rules that say these things are analytic. If I just introduce some new word, flob, right? And you don't know what, and you don't have an understanding of what flob is, and then I say, well, look, I've got this artificial language, and the artificial language has these rules which, distinguish, okay, these are the flob statements, these are the non-flob statements. That's useless, right? That doesn't help you understand flob at all. In the case of analyticity, right, think about, you could have an artificial language where there's just some rule which says a statement S is analytic for L just in case S contains at least 10 letters. Nothing stops you from constructing an artificial language and then just having that as one of the rules of the language. And you would have a very straightforward way of identifying the analytic statements within that language. But clearly this is an unusual use of the term analytic. It has nothing to do with the analytic-synthetic distinction as philosophers have used it. It doesn't have anything to do with the analytic-synthetic distinction in the intuitive sense that we explained at the beginning of this video. But maybe this is a bit too simplistic. So instead of using semantic rules to specify the analytic statements directly, there's an alternative way to approach this. We might say, well, look, a language is going to contain semantic rules which tell us that certain statements must be among the truths. So certain statements are among the truths. These rules are not going to appeal to some prior understanding of analyticity. They just stipulate certain statements of the language that are true. So we just postulate certain truths. So all we need is the notion of truth. For instance, a semantic rule in an artificial language that's based on classical logic might be all statements of the form not P and not P are true. Or maybe, if P is false, then if P then Q is true. Now, these rules do not tell us all of the truths of the language. They specify a class of statements that are to count as true. And having stipulated certain truths within the language that we can then take for granted, we can then apply the language in other areas of inquiry and work out what other things are true within the language and so on. But maybe we can now characterize analyticity by saying a statement S is analytic for L, just in case S is not just true, but true according to the semantic rules of L. We might have an artificial language with the rule that not P and not P is true, from which it follows that it is not the case that there are unicorns and there are no unicorns is true. Or consider a language for describing colours. We might stipulate as a rule of this language that objects can only have one colour in the same respect from the same perspective. So, this language attributes to each surface one colour and one colour only. And it follows from this that the statement, nothing is both red all over and green all over at the same time, is true. This kind of thing is presumably only going to work for artificial languages. Natural languages, don't appear to have explicitly stated semantic rules like this. But even in the context of artificial languages, there is a problem. What exactly counts as a semantic rule? We don't want to say that every true statement which says that some statements are true counts as a semantic rule, because otherwise literally all of the truths in the language would come out as analytic. For instance, it's true that there are 8 planets. So now imagine I was to just say, well, here's a semantic rule. The sentence, there are 8 planets, is true. Okay, surely this doesn't count as a semantic rule, because otherwise we could just have a semantic rule for every true sentence, and then every true sentence would end up being analytic. So the difficulty is, how do we distinguish the genuine semantic rules? Rules like all statements of the form not P and not P are true. How do we distinguish those from these kind of artificial gerrymandered semantic rules? Like the statement there are 8 planets is true. What's the difference? The general problem here is that if we're constructing an artificial language, then in principle we can just take any statements we like as the basic postulates, right? So we can actually just postulate that there are 8 planets is true. On the other hand, if we're investigating a language that already exists, like English, well, how do we tell which statements count as postulates? It doesn't look like there's any facts of the matter. As Quine says, any finite selection of statements, preferably true ones perhaps, is as much a set of postulates as any other. And that's the case regardless of whether we're dealing with natural languages or artificial languages. So Quine says that we have gotten no further here. Obviously the natural answer to what distinguishes a genuine semantic rule from a merely artificial one is going to be something about, well, the meanings of the terms. But then that's presupposing analyticity. So Quine summarizes, semantical rules determining the analytic statements of an artificial language are of interest only insofar as we already understand the notion of analyticity. They are of no help in gaining this understanding. So Quine concludes that we have no way of drawing the distinction between analytic and synthetic truths. The general idea of his argument is that the term analytic is one of a circle of terms, where if any one of those terms could be adequately understood, then we could define the others in terms of it. So there's terms like self-contradictory, necessarily, synonymous, definition, semantic rule. The problem is none of these terms have been adequately explained. Any attempt to explain one of them will end up appealing to the other terms in the circle. So, to explain analyticity, we appeal to synonymy. To explain synonymy, we appeal to necessity. To explain necessity, we appeal to analyticity. Right? At some point, we always end up either bottoming out in some just, vague term that's poorly understood, or we circle back around to analyticity itself. So we end up, it ends up becoming circular. None of these concepts have been shown to be capable of bearing the weight that philosophers have placed on them. And as far as Quine is concerned, there's no reason to think that there is actually a distinction between the analytic and the synthetic. Now, it's worth noting, before we end, that many philosophers have taken Quine's argument to have the fairly radical consequence that there actually just isn't any such thing as the meaning of a sentence. In fact, in later work, Quine himself is explicit that he's sort of attacking the very notion of meaning. It's not just that there are no sentences that are true in virtue of meaning. It's that there's no such thing as like the meaning of a sentence, period. See my videos on Quine's arguments for the indeterminacy of meaning for more on this. But with respect to the analytic-synthetic distinction, here's the reason in brief. Suppose that sentences have meanings. In their response to Quine, Grice and Strawson point out that this would allow a very straightforward definition of synonymy. As follows, we could say, two sentences are synonymous if and only if any true answer to the question, what does it mean, asked of one of them, is a true answer to the same question asked of the other. So if you take Verity is a vixen and Verity is a female fox, right, ask for each of these sentences, what does it mean? The correct answer will be the same in both cases. So two sentences are synonymous, just in case they mean the same thing. And with this, we break into the circle of terms and can define analyticity. Of course, Quine is going to say, well, we can't do that. If we give up analyticity, then we seem to have to give up sentence meaning. At the very least, we have to give up the idea that there is a determinate fact of the matter about the meaning of a sentence. Now, in practice, we might well ask the question, what does it mean, of two different sentences, and we might give the same answer each time. But on Quine's view, we can't say that this answer is correct or incorrect. When we talk about the meaning of a sentence, that's going to be more like a useful fiction or an idealization. And indeed, as far as Quine is concerned, the sort of unit of meaning is an entire language or an entire theory of the world. Some sentences are more resistant to refutation than others, but it's the whole theory that is tested against experience. And there's no sharp line between synthetic statements that can be refuted and analytic statements that are true come what may. And there's no determinate fact of the matter about what a sentence means. For any sentence, its truth is going to be the kind of conceptual and the empirical is intertwined, right? For any sentence, the truth is going to be a matter of like meaning and the matter of fact, but where we are not going to be able to identify or sort of isolate the meaning of the sentence independently of this sentence's role in the whole theory. It's worth noting as well that Quine's argument also threatens the idea of logical truths, what Quine called analytic statements of the first class. We noted that Quine does not object to logical truths. He grants in his argument that if we could define synonymy, then we could say that an analytic truth is any statement that can be transformed into a logical truth by substituting synonymous terms. So he seems to, at least in his article, he's granting logical truth. But we might think, well, actually, there's a bit of a problem here, because let's take a logical truth, of the form, right, for all x, if vx, then vx, or, for all x, if x is a vixen, then x is a vixen, or more colloquially, all vixens are vixens, right? That's an instance of a logical truth. But this only works if each instance of vixen has the same meaning, right? So if the first token of vixen means female foxes, and the second token of vixen means attractive women, then obviously this statement is false. So ordinarily we would say that this kind of thing isn't a counterexample to the logical truth, because it would be equivocating on the term vixen. When we characterize logical truths, we have to specify that different tokens of the same expressions have the same meaning. It must be that the first token of vixen is synonymous with the second token of vixen. Without sameness of meaning, it's not quite so obvious how we are to understand logical truth. So, maybe Quine's argument is a bit more radical than even he initially intended. And with that said, I'm going to leave that video there. Those were Quine's arguments against the analytic-synthetic distinction. And that's all for today. Thanks for watching. Bye.